When it comes to RAM and Photoshop, you can compare it to a giant whale and plankton. A whale, in order to stay alive, needs to eat a lot of plankton, and Photoshop is pretty much the same way. The more RAM you have in your computer, the better Photoshop will run. So when you install Photoshop and you notice that, it requires a certain amount of RAM on the box, that RAM is not to actually work with images. That RAM is to install Photoshop and to open it. So what you're going to have to think about is getting more RAM if you have a pretty basic system. And in my computer, I have about 2 gigabytes of RAM, and that's more than enough for what I do. I don't do a lot of crazy stuff in Photoshop. I mean, I do a lot of special effects, and I have files that have maybe 50, 60 layers. But I don't, go too far, and I compress my files every once in a while. And to do that, what you do is you merge the layers down, which I talk about in another lesson. But I just want to show you that when you work with a file in Photoshop, you want to try to have a good chunk of RAM in your system. Now, I'm going to go to an option here. I'm going to go to Photoshop, I'm going to go to Preferences, and then I'm going to go to General, and then I'm going to show you a section in Photoshop so that you can actually increase the performance. So we can go to the Performance section here, and you can check out what's going on in your computer system. I'm also going to show you how to allocate a part of your hard drive or an additional hard drive that may not be in this area here in a moment. Now, first of all, on my computer, it tells me that I have pretty much just under 1,500 megabytes available, which means that I have that much memory allocated in my computer that's not being used by the system itself. So even though I have 2 gigs of RAM, Macintosh OS X is using some of that to stay alive, Photoshop's using it to open up, and whatever application I'm using to do other things is currently taking up this RAM. And down here, it tells you that you can allow Photoshop to use what portion of that RAM. So in my case, I'm using 70% of my available RAM to run Photoshop. Now, I don't want to put this at 100% because when I'm using Photoshop on my computer, I often have Illustrator open or I have some other application open so I can drag and drop files. And that's very important. You don't want to max out this usage if you don't have to, because Photoshop will then take over your entire computer. There will be no more RAM left or no more thinking power left for any other applications. I guess the best way to think of RAM is think about your own brain, alright? And you've spent the entire weekend cramming for a math exam. And, somebody wants to talk to you about something else, like, what movie you want to go see this weekend. Well, your brain is too tired. You don't have time to think about going to see a movie because you've maxed out your RAM. You can only think about that math test. So, what we can also do is apply a scratch disk to help Photoshop out. Now, what does this mean, scratch disk? Well, let's say that we did crank this all the way to 100%, and Photoshop has no more brain power to do any of your calculations. It has no more room to think about how to apply this filter, or how to do this, or how to do that. A scratch disk is a backup, so Photoshop can use your actual hard drive or an external hard drive that you indicate here to do its calculations. It's a little slower, of course, than a physical RAM because it's not really RAM, it's your hard drive, and Photoshop using that to calculate the math, but it is an option nonetheless. And as you see here, I have one of my hard drives called Danger Zone, and on that hard drive it has 22.91 gigabytes available, which is a lot of space, and I have this active. So in the case that I'm doing some absolutely insane Photoshop work and I have all kinds of special effects and my RAM does run out, Photoshop will then switch to my hard drive and use this available space to perform those calculations. So once again, the more RAM you have in your computer, the better. RAM is extremely inexpensive now, so if you can max out your system or get a gig or more of RAM, it's great. So I would max it out if you can. If not, just make sure you have about 2 gigabytes, 3 gigabytes, or so on, and always allocate a scratch disk so it's a backup plan just in case you do eventually run out of your physical RAM.